So he's born in 1835, and this is the America of the time, at least politically. As you can see, there's, westward expansion has begun. There are 3 states west of the Mississippi River, but America is still very largely rural and sort of confined. When Mark Twain dies in 1910, America's a bit different. Not only has it expanded across the continent with little regard for who may have already been living there, but it is a global power with colonies and overseas territories and basically on the verge of empire. It's industrial, it's urban, it has a huge population. It's a very different country than the agrarian America of his youth. And if we look at some of the major inventions of his time, we're still using them. I mean, a lot of the sort of ordinary, everyday aspects of life that we still use, everything of crucial importance from the banana split to gin rummy, and organized baseball around spring training. I mean, so a lot of the things that are still essential to us come about over the course of his lifetime. When he's born, there's no instant communication. News travels as fast as a galloping horse, and it has done. The horse was domesticated. It's in its infancy. He dies with the telephone, the telegraph. That's a huge difference in quality of life, in life circumstances. So where is he actually born? The oddly and confusingly named town of Florida, Missouri. It is not the state of Florida. It's as if they were running out of names when they were creating new parts of Missouri and decided to start recycling state names. But he's born in the town of Florida, Missouri, in a not very impressive cabin. Florida is kind of a backwater that is on the verge of hopefully becoming not a backwater. They greatly anticipate the arrival of a train. And this is going to make the economics of Florida, Missouri. The train is never actually built out there. So his family, when he's quite young, moves to Hannibal, Missouri on the Mississippi River. This is where he actually grows up. Important to know, for somebody who's always kind of connected to the South, although his parents were from the Upper South, Virginia and Kentucky, Hannibal is 120 miles north of St. Louis. So it's very much the West back then, now the Midwest. It's also a place with a very important political formation. Missouri is a slave state, admitted as part of the Missouri Compromise to be a slave state. It is surrounded by free states. It's the only state north of the line that divides the slave states from the free states. That is, in fact, the essence of the Missouri Compromise. And Hannibal is in the densest area of slavery. Much of Missouri was actually, although it was legal, was not a place that had a large number of people involved in slavery. There's a very low enslaved population in much of Missouri, not so in Hannibal and the surrounding counties. And the Clemens family, we all know Mark Twain's real name is Samuel Clemens, and if you didn't, you do now. The Clemens family are, in fact, people who are very much involved. They are slaveholders. And this is, as Twain grows up, what he thinks is normal and the way the world works and just kind of naturally ordained. And obviously, his views change, as we'll see. But Hannibal's the front line. Free Illinois is just across that river. That's not great distance at this point. There are abolitionists across the river. That river is simultaneously the main economic engine. That's your method of trade. That's your glue. That's I-91 back then, because the roads stink. That river is connecting the country. River network will take you, through the heart of the nation. It's also a political boundary. It's a divider between two different definitions of who is and who is not a human being. And that's a pretty interesting thing to grow up right on that front line, that edge. Sam Clemens' father dies when he's quite young, and he goes to work. He's apprenticed to his older brother, so he learns the trade of being a printer. He's setting type by hand. I'm not sure about how, this 10-year age gap between young Sam Clemens and Orion Clemens' older brother, and I can think of few things as truly cruel as being apprenticed to your older brother, mostly because I have younger brothers, and I know what I would have done if they'd been my apprentices. But he does learn the trade of setting type individually, putting each letter in place to spell out an entire newspaper backwards, and then set it, ink it, print. So if he's born 1835 and he starts working when he's about 11 or 12 as a printer, he's working in the print shop during the Mexican-American War, during the Dred Scott decision. Actually, no, it's a bit late for him. But the 1850 compromise. He is setting type during the period when America is on the verge of civil war. So as he's coming of age, the country's falling apart. And he's in this printing shop reading the newspaper as he's composing it, making sense of what's going on as the anti-slavery debate heats up, as the war with Mexico brings huge amounts of new land into the country and a huge debate about what to do with that and whether it'll be slave or free. So this is a very interesting time to be working in a newspaper office and to come of age. Well, at age 17, he up sticks. He decides that Missouri just can't hold him, and he goes to the big cities of the East Coast, starting with New York. And the letter he writes back to his mother, after he gets there, doesn't tell her he's leaving, just says, "Guess what? I'm in New York." And as he explains, "Well, I was out of work in St. Louis, and I didn't fancy loafing in such a dry place where there is no pleasure to be seen without paying well for it. So I thought I might as well go to New York, as you do. I packed up my duds and left for this village where I arrived this morning." Now, this is a letter that is also shockingly full of racism. He has never really encountered a multicultural society, or at least a society that where people of color are free and equal citizens and carry themselves as such. So the same letter, when he's 17, includes the notorious lines, "I reckon I'd better black my face, for in these eastern states," and here he uses the N-word, "are considerably better than white people." And he refers to abolitionists as infernal, as coming from hell. So it's a pretty big shock to the system of this provincial kid from the Midwest, Southern ancestry, slaveholding family. From New York, he moves on to Philadelphia, which he likes a lot more than New York. And this is where he starts his writing career in a way. The letters he's sending back home are start to become published in his older brother's newspaper. His brother Orion starts printing the letters that his younger brother is sending back. And so pretty soon, young Sam Clemens is sending two different letters back. One with his private views, and the second has to be published. So he actually, in one letter, is very disparaging about the revolutionary sites in Philadelphia, saying, "Yeah, there's an old bench, whatever." And then the published version says, "You're in awe, realizing that Washington sat on this very bench." So he's learning the trade early. Well, he'd been setting type by hand, as I said, working as an itinerant typesetter, made it to Cincinnati, and eventually he gave up the career of being a typesetter. He'd finished with the printing world for now and became the trade to which he is most often associated, aside from being a writer, steamboat pilot. As he later explained, a pilot in those days was the only unfettered and entirely independent human being that lived in the earth. And his run is St. Louis to New Orleans. He's a steamboat pilot from 1857 to 1861. So the very eve of Civil War, this is when he is going up and down the heart of the country, being at that nexus of communication and trade and transport and passengers, picking up their views, talking to them, hearing the gossip, keeping a notebook and writing down the characters he meets on the river, which we'll come back to him later. These are actually a few of the boats we know that he piloted himself. His complete piloting record is a little bit unknown, but he loved it, absolutely loved it, and would have continued on as a steamboat pilot, except something rather inconvenient happened in 1861 for the river. The Civil War broke out, and that put an end to the free trade of the river. The federal plan at the start of the war was to close off the South's trade and kind of choke it, and controlling the Mississippi River would have been absolutely vital to both sides. As a trained pilot, Sam Clemens knows the river like the back of his hand, and that St. Louis down to New Orleans run is the crucial stretch of it. He's about 25 years old, no family. He is a prime military asset to both sides. So he skedaddles. He wants nothing to do with the war, and he goes out and gets away from it. You'll hear a lot of rumors about him fighting for the Confederacy. This is not true. He never joined the Confederate Army. For about 2 to 3 weeks, he was involved in a sort of local home guard militia that was called up to protect the town from whomever happened to come by. That's not the same as joining the Confederate Army. So just wanted to dispel that rumor out there. So he does make it out to Virginia City, Nevada, primarily, his time in Nevada, where he becomes a journalist. Failed as a miner, but succeeded in covering the mining boom of Nevada and the Wild West. Initially, he'd followed his older brother, Orion, who achieved the great heights he would ever achieve when he was appointed secretary to the newly formed Nevada Territory. He'd campaigned hard for Lincoln and was rewarded with a government job as a result, which shows you, the sort of family divided. Although Orion had grown up the child of slaveholders and was 10 years older than Sam Clemens, he was a pretty strong pro-union figure. Missouri, as one of the states, one of the 4 slaveholding states that does not leave the Union. So their family shows that kind of strain. At any rate, Orion goes out there, Sam Clemens follows him, and initially proposes that he'll be the secretary to the secretary. There is no work for the secretary to the secretary. He gets nowhere and ends up trying to become a miner. That doesn't work out, but he does succeed as a journalist covering the culture of the mining camps. And he's left a wonderful memory of what life was like as a frontier journalist in this time. We were all young fellows then, and there were 26 of us in the Virginia Enterprise office, a most gay and cheerful and noisy lot. The paper went to press at 2 a.m. Then all the staff and all the compositors gathered themselves together in the composing room and drank beer and sang the popular war songs of the day until dawn. When I look back now, they do seem preposterously young, those boys. Reminiscing in 1908, so thinking about young men very far from the war, drinking beer after putting a newspaper to bed is a pretty haunting image for the elderly Twain. Well, he manages to succeed quite well as a journalist in Nevada, succeeds so much that he gets himself involved in a local war with a rival newspaper that helps push him out of Nevada and to the boom town of San Francisco, where we immediately see his politics shifting. He is deeply critical of the anti-Chinese attitude that had pervaded San Francisco in this period. So just a few years, 13 years after we have this shockingly racist letter back home, he's now actually criticizing the institutions of power in San Francisco, particularly the police and the government officials, for using their power to harass Chinese immigrants. And in a really remarkable piece of writing called Disgraceful Persecution of a Boy, he attacks an incident where a boy had thrown stones at a Chinese man, and everyone said, oh, this is terrible, you shouldn't do that. And Twain instead says, what did he learn? What did every single piece of power in the city do but show him anti-Chinese prejudice? And then he acts on it, and now you get upset he finally acted on everything you taught him. And don't look at the individual, look at the structure. Look at the environment in which the individual grows up. And that's another key Twainian theme, the individual versus their environment. But in this piece, Disgraceful Persecution of a Boy, he actually quotes the Dred Scott decision. He actually quotes the notorious decision that had one of the very last sort of the key pieces that lead up to the Civil War, the Supreme Court decision that descendants of enslaved people could never be U.S. citizens and, quote, had no rights the white man was bound to respect. That phrase is actually revived by Twain to attack anti-Chinese attitudes. So you can really get a very strong sense of, as an adult, living in these different places, how much his own political attitudes have changed. We also see in this period his emergence as a lecturer and travel writer. He was basically between California and Nevada for most of the 1860s and got a plum job in the middle of this as a correspondent in the Sandwich Islands, now Hawaii, where he was out and wrote more travel letters back home, including the wonderful analysis about missionaries and how much he hated them, basically, and wrote about the sarcastically commenting how wonderful it was that missionaries had finally shown up to tell the natives who'd lived in this incredible paradise their whole life there was finally a hell to look forward to. So he's already criticizing organized religion, criticizing the police, criticizing institutions of power, doing it humorously, but the edge is there. This ability as a travel writer gets him the next plum job. You can see him working his way up the ladder from Nevada to San Francisco to finally he becomes the correspondent on a voyage through the Mediterranean and the Middle East, which becomes the book The Innocents Abroad. But it starts off as the journal of a pleasure cruise. A very wealthy band of pilgrims went on this grand voyage that you can see through the Holy Land, with Twain stuck along with them, and he's supposed to cover the journey and the beautiful sights they see. He has a lot more fun making fun of the fellow passengers and satirizing them. And he mails these articles back home on the course of the journey that are published. He doesn't realize that the friends of these people buy the newspaper, read the unpleasant description of their friends, and mail the newspaper ahead to the next port of call. So his writing catches up with him, and he was rather more popular the first half of the voyage than he was the second half of the voyage. But he becomes the center of a kind of, the bad boys who drink and gamble and are not there for religious reasons. I know it's Ash Wednesday, and I'm tempted to tell you his most sacrilegious joke, but I won't, out of respect for, you can ask me afterwards. But one of the people who really does not want to sing hymns on the deck and wants to go play poker with the Bad Boys Club is a young guy named Charlie Langdon. He's too young, he's 17, Sam Clemens is 31 at this point, he's told to go away. Well, later on in the voyage, Charlie produces a picture of his beautiful, wealthy older sister. Now he can come play poker. Oh, you're very much welcome in the cabin now. And so when they return home, Samuel Clemens starts to court Olivia Langdon, and in 1870, they're married. They move initially to Buffalo, New York, where Olivia's father, who's a very wealthy coal and lumber baron, buys them a very grand house. I've been told that being bought a house is not a standard father-in-law present, but I'm holding out hope. But at any rate, what's important here is that Olivia is from a very, very different background. She's been to college. Sam Clemens left school at 11. Her family are not only abolitionists, they're Underground Railroad activists. They leave their church and start a new church because the church they're part of will not condemn slavery. They import Thomas Kennicott Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's, one of her many ministerial brothers, to be the pastor of this church. She is very refined and very polite. He likes to drink, smoke, gamble, and swear. 4 proposals later, they finally make it work. But Jervis Langdon, Sam's father-in-law, helps him buy controlling interest in the Buffalo Express newspaper. And that's going to be his job. He's going to be a newspaper editor and publisher. So he's gone from typesetter to journalist to owner. And you can get a sense of how key the newspaper world was to his career. They don't last in Buffalo very long, unfortunately, but fortunately for us, they moved to Hartford in 1871. And you can see an image of Hartford a bit earlier than the period when they moved to it, but I want to point out, this is basically advertising. This is showing off the river and its transport links, factories, railroad tracks, and that set of spiky things in the middle, that's a line of churches down Main Street. So it's sort of broadcasting the industry and morality of the city at this point. And how bucolic the immediate surrounds are. So a few years later, a different view of the city, and you can see how it's expanding rapidly in this period. They move to where that red star is. The neighborhood we'll talk about in a moment called Nook Farm. But Clemens is first in Hartford almost a decade earlier. He's there in the late 1860s. They wanted to move to Hartford, but there were a couple options, and Buffalo won out initially. But his travel writing from Hartford in his first visit is pretty extraordinary. I'm in Hartford, Connecticut. I think this is the best built and handsomest town I have ever seen. They call New England the land of steady habits, and I see the evidence about me that it was not named amiss. As I came along the principal street today, smoking, of course, I noticed that of the 200 men in sight at one time, only 2 were smoking beside myself. I had to walk 3 blocks to find a cigar store. I saw no drinking saloons at all in the street, but I was not looking for any. I hear no swearing here. I see no one chewing tobacco. I have found nobody drunk. What a singular country it is. Not his place initially. At the hospitable mansion where I am a guest, I have to smoke surreptitiously when all are in bed to save my reputation, and then draw suspicion upon the cat when the family detect the unfamiliar odor. I was never so absurdly pauper in the broad light of day on my life as I have been the last day or 2. So far, I am safe, but I'm sorry to say that the cat has lost caste. She has steadily decreased in popularity since I made my advent here. She has achieved a reputation for smoking and may justly be regarded as a degraded, a dishonored, a ruined cat. We have the broadest, straightest streets in Hartford that ever led a city to destruction. The dwelling houses are the amplest in size and the shapeliest and have the most capacious ornamental grounds about them. Then he goes on to describe Hartford as the center of Connecticut wealth, all the manufacturing and the industry that fascinates him here. So, What is this Hartford to which he's moving? Why is it so wealthy? Heavy industry, such as the Colt factory, or also Sharps, another made repeating rifles. Typewriters, bicycles. It's not necessarily textile mills that we often associate with other parts of New England heavy industry. It's very complicated machines, things that are difficult to make, Hartford makes. So you can see Hartford as part of a network of industrial cities along the Connecticut River Valley that really specialize in, they're kind of the Silicon Valley of their day. Complicated machinery, complicated engineering, that's Hartford. And that obviously demands high wages, it's skilled people working in these places that increases the overall cost of living and the overall wealth of the city. Add to that a vibrant social life, theaters and other sort of civic platforms give Twain a chance to speak, such as at elections or for philanthropic causes. And so when they move, he involves himself in the life of the city, people still going to lectures in downtown Hartford, like now. He's one of the lecturers you can see. It's also a publishing center. Key to that is his publisher is based here, the American Publishing Company. They sell through a format called subscription publishing, so it's sort of door-to-door sales. And the subscriber would specify what kind of book they wanted, how expensive a binding they wanted to pay for. So the publisher knew the print run in advance. Subscription publishing did not traditionally produce great novels. It was family Bibles and medical texts and things like that. So Twain got a better royalty rate by publishing through a subscription publisher, but he lost some status, potentially. That's always a tension there. We have heavy industry, we have publishing, and then we have arts and culture. The Wadsworth, which he visits at his first visit, oldest continuously operating public art museum in the country. Also a site of lectures and a sort of a center for public education in this period. And then lastly, Bushnell Park, which the founder, Horace Bushnell, calls the city's front parlor, the common space for a rapidly industrializing city to still have a space where the old Yankee elite and the new immigrants working in the factories can come together. It sort of ties back into the idea of the Wadsworth and these public lecture venues where everyone needs a common gathering space, whatever their background. So Hartford has wealth, it has culture, and it has public spirit, as evidenced by these institutions. It also has baseball. It is a charter member of the National League. Unfortunately, the Dark Blues don't last very long, but they do exist mostly in order to give teams a chance to play games between New York and Boston. Oh well. We know Twain was a fan. We know he went to see them because he left us a note in the newspaper, which reads, $205 reward. At the great baseball match on Tuesday, while I was engaged in hurrahing, a small boy walked off with an English-made brown silk umbrella belonging to me and forgot to bring it back. I will pay $5 for the return of that umbrella in good condition to my house in Farmington Avenue. I do not want the boy in an active state, but will pay $200 for his remains. He later called baseball the very symbol, the outward and visible expression of the drive and push and rush and struggle of the raging, tearing, booming 19th century. And I love that quote because we look back at these pictures, these sepia pictures of people in their old-fashioned suits, and it looks gentle to us. But they experienced this time as one of great change, as one of transformation, of industry and new inventions, and as one of raging, tearing, and booming. I think that's just captured so well there. So where is he actually living in this Hartford of education, industry, and baseball? In The neighborhood of Nook Farm, which, as you can see from this 1890s image, was very wooded and felt very pastoral. And as the map shows you, it's kind of a network of houses on the edge of the city. Its members are all interconnected. They're all intermarried. So it's both a family network and a physical secluded compound right where the city becomes the countryside, as it were. And I won't go through every single relationship up there, but just, take it as evidence that this is an extended network gathered through the Beecher family, that preeminent New England intellectual family. One of the founders of the neighborhood, John Hooker, wrote, "The early comers were generally family or personal friends, and we lived like a little society by ourselves, each of us making free of the other's houses, and each keeping open house, and all of us frequently gathering for a social evening or to welcome some friendly visitor, often some person distinguished in political, literary, or philanthropic life who'd come to some of our houses." This idea that there's a shared culture. He talks about our so much in that quote. Our houses. And they're open and free. Anybody can just wander in unannounced. Everyone takes part in this common dinner party culture where they get to meet the leading philanthropists and politicians and writers of the day. See the grandeur of the houses. It's not just the Mark Twain house, which you can see in the picture behind you. There's other gracious homes in the period. And we get wonderful accounts of Nook Farm life, like this letter from William Dean Howells, a major Boston literary figure. "Did I speak in my last of the charming visit I had had with Warner and Mr. Mark Twain at Hartford? It seemed to me quite an ideal life. They lived very near each other in a sort of suburban grove. Their neighbors are the Stows and Hookers and a great many delightful people. They go in and out of each other's houses without ringing, and nobody gets more than the first syllable of his first name. They call their minister Joe Twitchell." So it's this wonderful account of just constantly going in and out and debating and eating dinner together. You get a sense of a real cohesiveness of this neighborhood. He's not just living anywhere in the city. He's living as part of a very specific community gathered together around a shared culture of literature, philanthropy, and discussion. So who are they? Joseph Twitchell, pastor of Asylum Hill Congregational Church, which at the very first time Twain visited Hartford, he referred to, based on its wealthy congregation, as the Church of the Holy Speculators, which Twitchell thought was very funny, and that helped them become close friends. Twitchell is actually one of the ministers who officiated at the marriage of Sam and Livy. They go for very long walks in which Twain gets to sort of debate his books and new ideas, and they actually paid for Twitchell to go to Europe with them to act as a walking companion, which became the book A Tramp Abroad. So Twitchell as a sounding board is key to some of the literary ideas that Twain is able to craft in this period. Also a major Connecticut political figure, Joseph Hawley, who had married a Beecher cousin. He's a lawyer, later runs the Hartford Evening Press, becomes a Civil War hero, ends up as Major General, serves as governor of Connecticut, 66 to 67, then co-owns and co-edits the Hartford Courant, and later serves in the U.S. House of Representatives, is the chair of the Philadelphia Centenary Exposition in 1876, this great, really important World's Fair, celebration of America's first 100 years, and then is the U.S. Senator from Connecticut, 1881 to 1905. So he's a major political figure at the heart of Nook Farm, and we know that Twain speaks on his behalf at some public meetings for his political career several times. Also extremely important, Harriet Beecher Stowe, single best-selling, or Uncle Tom's Cabin is a single best-selling novel of the 19th century. The only book to outsell it is the Bible. The Bible sold rather a lot of copies in the 19th century. So she's pretty fair. It's okay to be beaten by that. By the time she's living in Hartford, it's towards the end of her career, end of her life, but there's still some really important work that she does while living in Nook Farm, notably publishing The American Woman's Home, which is a book that's an attempt to professionalize and give important status to the art of keeping house, and to elevate the private work of women to the same status as the public work of men. It's a very different form of feminism than would later be developed, which is about giving a public status to women, but this is her iteration of it, to have women's work taken seriously. She is a central figure in this neighborhood, and when they first move in, Twain goes to visit her, and he embraces Nook Farm informality by going over without his hat and tie. And Olivia, who's from a very well-to-do family, is shocked, tells him he should not have done that, and so he sent the butler back over to the house with his hat and tie on a plate. And then Harriet Beecher Stowe joked that, as a fellow writer, Twain had visited her in installments, which is how books are often published in that period. Her sister, Isabella Beecher Hooker, also lives in the neighborhood. This is actually the house that where he stays initially, when he says the hospitable mansion where he destroys the cat's reputation. That was the home of Isabella Beecher Hooker and John Hooker. She is one of the architects of, the founders of Nook Farm with her husband and sister-in-law. And she's a major figure in the women's rights campaign. She's on the National Suffrage Speaking Tour in 1870. She is a member of the Suffrage Convention, and importantly, is a mover behind the Married Women's Property Act of 1877, which allows women in Connecticut to own their own property after marriage. So she's a very different approach to feminism than her sister. So you can see that public-private division, but she's a major political figure, public figure in her own day. Then lastly, Charles Dudley Warner, who is key to Mark Twain's development. Warner was co-editor of the Hartford Courant with Joseph Hawley. He was also briefly a lawyer, but didn't practice much in Hartford. And Twain and Warner became good friends. Co-wrote The Gilded Age with Twain in 1873. This is Twain's first true novel. Before this, Twain was a travel writer and travel lecturer and journalist, and had written memoir and sketches, fictionalized memoir, but had not written a true novel. He'd actually begun working on Tom Sawyer, but hadn't published it yet. So his very first published novel is co-written with a Nook Farm neighbor. There is a fantastic account of this from one of a guest in the home, where she writes about how they would get together in the evenings and compare, having written the same versions of, or different versions of the same chapter, and then Olivia Langdon and Susan Warner would vote on whose was better. And they would ceremonially burn the loser's manuscript. Get good at writing quickly, if that's the stakes. But this whole novel comes about because Charlie Warner and Sam Clemens were teasing their wives for not reading good enough novels. They challenged them to write a better one. And I love this image. You have a dinner party, intellectual women debating literature with the men, editing it, and then it produces a book that titles the entire era of this period in America's history. So it really ties together a lot of Nook Farm strands. Where is this taking place? Eventually, in 1874, they build the family home that is the museum where I had the privilege of working for many years. It's this grand architectural statement that this young guy traveling all over the world, living hand to mouth, working as a peripatetic journalist and typesetter, he's home. He's made it. Thank you, Olivia's family, for bankrolling this kind of lifestyle. See how rural the neighborhood feels in this period. We'll also get a sense from the architectural drawings of the kind of the fantasy castle-like nature of the house as originally conceived. I think this image of the house before it was built, the architect's exterior plan, shows us a kind of a whimsical feel to the house. Where he raises a family. His daughters, Susie, Clara, and Jean, with whom there's a great array of storytelling games that helps him hone his craft as a writer and storyteller. And Olivia is his editor in this period. There's letters to the publisher that say, I know I'm late, but Livy hasn't seen the manuscript yet, so you can't have it. So we cannot underestimate or downplay the role of his family, all of whom were female, in the emergence of his writing. There's a great family tradition of charades and theater. And so that kind of playfulness and intellectual life is a big part of family culture for them. This is also a neighborhood run off the work of immigrant servants. Patrick McAleer up there with the horse, the coachman, Katie Leary, then going down with the baby, Rosa Hayes, who's a German-American immigrant, and John and Ellen O'Neill, the gardeners. So we don't want to lose the fact that there's a lot of work that goes into creating a household where all you have to do is write and have literary dinner parties. And where does he get to write? It's in Elmira, New York, visiting Olivia's family over the summer, what they called Do As You Please Hall, where there was complete freedom. And because his sister-in-law hated cigar smoke, and he smoked 20 to 40 a day, plus pipes, she built him this beautiful little study. There it is on the inside. I think if we had that kind of environment, we could all produce some pretty good writing with nothing to do but sit in that little space. So while living in Hartford and spending summers in Elmira, he produces nearly every book on which his reputation rests. And if we look at the illustrations to A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, the last major novel of his Connecticut period, and one set in Hartford that starts with the foreman of the colt factory as the very symbol of progress, we can see through the illustrations of the illustrator, Dan Beard, the progression of medieval feudalism, 19th century slavery, and then late 19th century capitalism. Twain's work has gotten very political at this point. He published Huckleberry Finn in 1885, this incredible attack on injustice in Jim Crow, where he uses the N-word over 200 times on purpose to show to show how destructive a racist society actually is. He's gone from using it himself to trying to incriminate people by putting it in the mouths of unsavory characters. And then with Connecticut Yankee, we have this broad attack on injustice where text lifted from the Connecticut Constitution is literally blowing off the chains of the Middle Ages. And King Arthur's Middle Ages for Twain is not, it's a very thinly disguised version of the 19th century. It's the corruption he sees in his own lifetime. So we can see how much living in Nook Farm, living with what had been an abolitionist neighborhood before the war, talking with Harriet Beecher Stowe, his abolitionist wife, the wider network of neighbors, Isabella Beecher Hooker, has shaped his politics to now he's writing this kind of material. And he comes out with it. He says, the blunting effect of slavery upon the slaveholders' moral perceptions are known and conceded the world over, and the privileged class and aristocracy is but a band of slaveholders under another name. So he's really imbued with the sort of Yankee independence, and I think you can see that coming out in his literature in this period. They also act on it. They fund the education, he and Olivia, of Charles Ethan Porter. They send him to Paris to train as a painter. He's a Rockville artist, African American, and also pay for tuition, anonymously pay for the tuition of Warner T. McGinn, the first African American graduate of Yale Law School. And there's clear guilt from Twain for his own upbringing in this, as he explains to the dean of the Yale School of Law, "I do not believe I would very cheerfully help a white student who would ask a benevolence of a stranger, but I do not feel so about the other color. We have ground the manhood out of them, and the shame is ours, not theirs, and we should pay for it." Sounds like reparations to me. And it sounds like an acknowledgement that he had been implicated in deeply dehumanizing practice of reducing people to things by enslaving them, and now he's trying to make up for it, at least with Warner T. McGinn. Maybe it's not enough, but it's a start for him at least. And you can also see, lastly, in this, the sort of activism of Hartford. I think this goes back to this idea of, as I was talking about with the Wadsworth and Bushnell Park, this idea that money has obligations. It's one of Horace Bushnell's key arguments. Wealth then becomes incumbent on those with wealth to create something good for their city. This is Twain putting his and Olivia's money back into public good. Fortunately, this lifestyle is very expensive, and they're forced to leave in the 1890s. They moved to Europe to avoid the cost of running a grand Nook Farm home. All those dinner parties were not cheap. They spent about the same on dinner in a week as they paid their maid all year, or same on food in general, I should say. They live in Europe, first Berlin, which he loves, and then Paris, which he does not love. He writes, France has neither summer nor winter nor morals. Aside from that, it is a fine country. A little more scandalously, he says, a Frenchman's home is where another man's wife is. Not a fan. London, at the height of the British Empire, which he loves. And then Vienna, where he lives for almost 2 years, and where Sigmund Freud hears him lecture. We always sort of think of Twain as this white-suited yokel funny man. And I've hoped in the course so far, I've tried to position him as an elite New England writer, respected within a circle of politicians and other intellectual figures. Sigmund Freud and Twain are not normally put into the same category. But Freud is going to hear him lecture in Vienna. I think that tells you the kind of intellectual standing that was given to him in his own time. After living in Europe and around the world tour in the 1890s, they make it back to the US, living in New York. He's definitely living in the wealthy Upper East Side, living in the wealthy neighborhoods. His political sympathies at this point, and he's writing on behalf of those living in the Lower East Side, which you can also see pictured, but he's not living there himself. He is very wealthy, he's very comfortable, he's very happy to be ensconced in that environment, but he'll use his pen and his checkbook on behalf of others. And he sees no contradiction in enjoying a very lavish lifestyle while he does so. The very final home is in Redding, Connecticut, a place called Stormfield, a villa modeled on a place he and Olivia had stayed outside of Florence at the very end of Olivia's life. She predeceased him, even though she was 10 years younger. She had a very weak heart for most of her life. As many of you know, his oldest daughter, Susie, also predeceased him, and Olivia. She died in 1896, and that was one of the reasons why emotionally they could never come back to Hartford. It was just too painful to return to Hartford after Susie had died there. So after Olivia finally passed away, he built Stormfield. It was the site of the last sort of happy family moment, the wedding of his middle daughter, Clara, to a Russian conductor and composer, Osip Gavrilovich. They had met as music students in Vienna. And again, it sort of emphasizes the underappreciated cosmopolitanism of the Clemens family. Mark Twain finally dies in 1910, although youngest daughter Jean sadly predeceases him in 1909. Every state where Mark Twain lived or traveled, he saw a fair bit for somebody born in 1835. And you can see America changing over the course of his lifetime. Where does he actually live? These aren't all the places this is every place he stayed for at least a few months. Look at the very bottom of the left-hand side and the very top of the right. The 20-year period in Hartford is the longest stretch of time in one spot. Before that, he's wandering, uncertain, living hand to mouth. After that, he's again wandering for different reasons. But this window in Hartford, the key years of when he's an adult, these are the years of family, of friends, and unsurprisingly to me, of tremendous literary production. It's that intellectual environment of Nook Farm, being halfway between New York and Boston, being able to take advantage of the wider cultural and economic life of Hartford that allows these books to flourish. He writes about the Mississippi River Valley of his youth, but he does so from the cultural certainty and economic security of this city. And just looking at the kind of wandering years that bookend the core of his time here, I think this alone demonstrates that he's not here randomly. This city has a lot to say for what comes out of his pen while he's here. Thanks very much.